She arrived with dust on her dress and a name on her heels. He answered with 5 words that changed everything. The cabin was a testament to a life lived alone. The single cot was built into the wall, its wool blanket folded with military precision. 1 chair sat at the small table, 1 tin cup hung from a hook by the stone hearth, and 1 rifle rested on pegs above the door. Elias moved through the small space with a quiet economy of motion that spoke of years spent honing a routine for one. The late summer heat pressed in, heavy and thick with the scent of pine and dry earth. Outside, the world was a vast, indifferent expanse of territory he knew as well as the lines on his own hands. Inside, the world was a space he could control, down to the last splinter in the floorboards. He ran a whetstone along the edge of his skinning knife. His hands, calloused and capable, worked with a practiced grace. They could fell a tree, set a trap, or stitch a wound with equal steadiness. They were not gentle hands, but they were careful. He measured his life in small, solitary tasks. Wood chopped, water hauled, perimeter checked. He scanned the tree line from his window, not for beauty, but for threats, for change. It was a habit so deeply ingrained, he no longer noticed he was doing it. The silence was his companion, a familiar weight in the air. Loneliness was a different thing, a dull ache he had learned to ignore, like the memory of an old injury that throbbed only when the weather turned. He finished with the knife, testing the blade against his thumb before wiping it clean and setting it aside. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that bled through the open door. He rose to light the lamp, the hiss of the match and the bloom of soft yellow light pushing the encroaching darkness back into the corners. The flame reflected in the single pane of glass, showing him a man he barely recognized, beard stubbled, jaw tight, eyes narrowed in perpetual watchfulness. He was a man made of straight lines and hard angles, planed down by the wilderness until only the essential remained. He turned from his reflection, the house behind him silent, orderly, and empty. A bed for one, a lamp for one, a life for one. It was enough. It had to be. Then came the sound that did not belong, a frantic, desperate knocking on his door. It was not the rap of a neighbor or the thump of a lost trapper. It was the sound of a small bird beating itself against a window pane, a sound of pure, unadulterated fear. Elias did not reach for his rifle. He simply stood, motionless, in the center of his small, controlled world, and listened as the sound that would change everything came again. He opened the door a crack, his body a solid block of shadow in the frame. The woman standing on his porch flinched back, her hand flying to her throat. He recognized her, of course. Clara Morrow, Jacob's wife. He'd seen her in the dusty street of the nearest settlement, always a step behind her husband, her eyes downcast. Now her eyes were wide and dark in a face pale with terror. Her dress was torn at the hem, and a fine layer of dust coated her from her worn boots to the loose strands of hair escaping her bun. She held a small, hastily packed carpet bag in one hand. "Elias," she breathed, her voice a ragged whisper. It was the first time he had ever heard her speak his name. He said nothing, his gaze sweeping past her to dark trails she'd come up, scanning for any sign of pursuit. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. I need help," she said, her proud chin trembling. "Jacob is... he's gone. A fever. And Mr. Finch." She stopped, swallowing hard, unable to finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Elias knew men like Finch, men who saw a widow not as a grieving woman, but as an unclaimed asset, an opportunity. Finch had been Jacob's partner in some speculative land claim, a man with soft hands and a smile that never reached his eyes. He says the claim, the house, it all reverts to him. He says I'm part of the bargain." The words were stark and ugly in the quiet evening air. Elias looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the resilience in the set of her shoulders, the fierce pride fighting the fear in her eyes. She was a survivor, bent but not yet broken. He had owed Jacob a debt, a life debt from a rock slide years ago that was never spoken of but always understood. A debt that, it seemed, had just come due. He stepped back, pulling the door wider. It was not a gesture of welcome, so much as a simple physical fact, an opening. "Come inside," he said. The words were gravelly from disuse. She hesitated for only a second, a flicker of doubt in her eyes, before she ducked under his arm and into the lamplit warmth of the cabin. The air inside immediately felt different, charged with her presence. The small space, once his fortress of solitude, now held 2 heartbeats, 2 breaths. He closed the door, the heavy thud of the latch sliding home echoing in the sudden, profound silence. He watched her stand uncertainly in the middle of the floor, clutching her bag like a shield. She looked so out of place, a fragile thing in his world of wood and iron. He saw the way her gaze darted from the single cot to the single chair. He saw the moment she understood the full measure of his solitude and the imposition she had become. For a long moment he said nothing. He simply absorbed the reality of her presence. Then he moved. He took the blanket from his cot, his motions as deliberate as ever, and laid it on the floorboards before the hearth. "You take the bed," he stated. It was not a request. He gestured to the chair. "Sit. I'll get you some water." Clara's world had shrunk to the 4 walls of the cabin. For 3 days she had existed in this small, quiet space, her universe defined by the man who moved through it with such silent purpose. The fear that had propelled her up the mountain trail had receded, replaced by a strange, watchful stillness. She slept in his bed, the scent of dried herbs and clean wool a surprising comfort. He slept on the floor by the hearth, a dark, unmoving shape in the fire's dying glow. He never complained, never spoke of it. The arrangement was simply a fact, like the rising of the sun. Their lives began to braid together in small domestic knots. In the mornings, he would be gone before she woke, and she would find a bucket of fresh water by the door and a neat stack of firewood beside the stove. She, in turn, would use the meager supplies from her bag and his larder to make coffee and a simple breakfast. She'd leave his portion on the table, covered. When he returned, he would eat without comment and wash his own plate and cup. The silence between them was vast, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the sound of his boots on the floorboards, the rustle of her skirts as she moved about the small room, the soft clink of a spoon against a bowl. The thin walls offered no privacy. She heard every move he made, every quiet breath he took in the night. It should have felt intrusive, but instead, it felt protective. It was the sound of a guard on his watch. She was a survivor. She knew how to read people. She had spent years reading the moods of her late husband, a good man, but a volatile one. She watched Elias. She saw the way his large hands could be so gentle when coaxing a flame in the wood stove. She saw the care he took in mending a strap on his saddle, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was a man who paid attention to details. He noticed things. He noticed the hem of her dress, torn during her flight. She saw his eyes catch on it one afternoon as she swept the floor. He said nothing, but the next morning, a small tin containing a needle and a spool of dark thread sat on the table beside her plate. He was already gone, out checking his trap lines. She picked up the tin, its cool weight solid in her palm. It was an offering. It was a recognition of her need, a quiet act of service that asked for nothing in return. That night, by the light of the single lamp, she sat in the chair and mended her dress. He sat on the floor across the room, sharpening his axe, a rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a steadying counterpoint to her tiny stitches. He did not watch her, but she felt his awareness of her, a quiet, grounding presence. For the first time in a very long time, she felt a sliver of peace. She was in a stranger's home, a refugee from her own life, but the man on the floor who slept between. Her and the door made her feel safer than she had ever felt behind the locked door of her own house. The rhythm of their days settled into a quiet pattern. It was a life of shared tasks, of orbits that crossed in the small cabin with increasing frequency and decreasing awkwardness. One evening, Elias sat at the table, methodically cleaning his rifle. The familiar, metallic scent of gun oil filled the small space. He had disassembled the weapon into a dozen pieces, his fingers moving with an assuredness that was mesmerizing to watch. Clara sat near the hearth, darning one of his wool socks. The fabric was rough under her fingers, the hole at the heel worn through from miles of walking. Mending his things felt right, a small contribution to the sanctuary he provided. It was an exchange, not of coin, but of care. He finished his work, the rifle now reassembled and gleaming in the lamplight. He set it back on its pegs above the door. Then he picked up the long skinning knife from his belt, the one he had been sharpening the day she arrived. He held it for a moment before placing it on the table, its sharp edge facing away from her. He rose and went outside to split the last of the day's kindling. Clara watched him go. The knife lay on the table, a tool of his trade, a symbol of his self-sufficiency and the latent violence of the world he inhabited. It was also a sign of immense trust. He had left a weapon within her reach in the home he now shared with her. When he came back inside, his arms full of wood, he stopped when he saw her standing by the table. She picked up the knife. His body went still, his eyes fixed on her hands. She held it carefully, and then turning it, she extended it to him, hilt first. A silent acknowledgment. "I trust you. I am not a threat to you." He took it from her, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through the quiet air. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw a flicker of something she couldn't name. It was not surprise, but a deep, quiet recognition. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice low. He slid the knife back into the sheath at his belt. The moment passed, but the space between them had changed. It had shrunk. Later, as she struggled to get a proper draft going in the wood stove, he came to stand behind her. He didn't take over. He simply pointed. "The damper. It needs to be open a finger's width more." His voice was a low rumble near her ear. She adjusted it, and the fire roared to life. "There," he said, a note of satisfaction in his tone. He didn't move away immediately. He just stood there, his presence a warm, solid weight behind her. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, a different kind of warmth than the fire in the stove. It was a heat that felt steady and safe. The summer heat wave did not break. It settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket, making the air in the cabin thick and still. Elias worked outside from sunup to sundown, his skin turning a deeper bronze, his clothes perpetually damp with sweat. He moved slower in the heat, his usual economy of motion replaced by a deliberate, energy-conserving pace. Clara watched him from the shade of the porch, a growing ache in her chest that she recognized as a dangerous mix of sympathy and yearning. He was so relentlessly capable, so self-contained, she sometimes forgot he was made of flesh and blood. This afternoon, he stumbled on his way back to the cabin, catching himself on the doorframe. He was pale beneath his tan, his breathing harsh. He sank onto the bench just inside the door, head in his hands, sweat dripping from his hair onto the dusty floorboards. He didn't seem to have the strength to get a drink. Clara's heart clenched. Without a word, she went to the water bucket, dipped a clean rag into the cool liquid, and wrung it out. She hesitated for only a beat, her own breath catching in her throat. This was a boundary, a line she had not yet crossed. She knelt before him. "Elias?" she said softly. He lifted his head slowly, his eyes clouded with exhaustion. He looked at her, and in his gaze she saw not a protest, but a weary surrender. It was permission. She reached out and gently placed the cool, damp cloth on the back of his neck. He flinched at the initial contact, a reflexive tightening of his powerful shoulders. Then, as the coolness seeped into his overheated skin, a long, shuddering sigh escaped him. He leaned into her touch, just slightly, and closed his eyes. It was the most vulnerable she had ever seen him. The protector, for a fleeting moment, being tended to. His stillness was a profound act of trust. He was allowing her to care for him, allowing her to see a moment of weakness. She held the cloth in place, her fingers brushing the rough collar of his shirt, the warm, damp skin of his neck. She could feel the steady, thumping pulse beneath his skin, a powerful rhythm of life. The silence in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. It was the heat, the hush, the weight of her hand on his neck. It was a chosen moment of closeness, offered and accepted without a single word. When he finally opened his eyes, the weariness was still there, but something else had joined it. A deep, quiet gratitude that made her stomach flutter. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. His eyes, fixed on hers, said everything. Evening settled, and with it, a marginal cooling of the air. A single lamp pushed back the shadows, creating an island of golden light around the small table. Elias sat on a low stool, a block of pine in one hand and his knife in the other. He was carving, the blade peeling away delicate curls of wood to reveal the shape hidden within. He worked with the same focused intensity he applied to every task, his large hands surprisingly deft. Clara sat in the room's only chair, mending a tear in her sleeve, her own work a quiet parallel to his. The only sounds were the soft scrape of his knife and the whisper of her needle through cloth. The quiet was comfortable now, a shared space rather than an empty one. She found herself watching his hands, the way the muscles in his forearms shifted with each controlled movement. He was carving a bird, its wings half unfurled. "My father used to carve," she said, the words slipping out into the silence before she could stop them. He paused, his knife stilling. He looked up, his expression unreadable in the shifting light. It was the first time she had volunteered anything about her past. "He made small animals for the children in our village." He said it kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. Elias looked down at the half-finished bird in his hand. He ran his thumb over the smooth wood. "It does that," he agreed, his voice a low burr. He didn't press for more, but he didn't return to his carving either. He waited, granting her the space to continue if she wished. The consideration was a balm. He was a gentle man, she added softly, a wave of old sorrow washing over her. "I miss that." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and true. Elias set the bird and his knife on the table. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze serious and direct. "You are safe here, Clara," he said. He had said it before, in different ways, but this time felt different. This time, it felt less like a statement of fact and more like a personal vow. And then, a small miracle occurred. A genuine smile touched her lips, a small, weary curve that transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of fear and grief for a fleeting moment. It was the first time he had seen it, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was like watching the sun break through heavy clouds. "I know," she said. In response, a corresponding softness eased the hard lines around his own mouth. He didn't smile back, not truly, but the intensity in his eyes softened into something warmer, something akin to wonder. He said her name, a single word, spoken so quietly it was almost a thought. Clara. The sound of it, spoken in that low, careful tone, felt more intimate than any touch. It was a discovery, an acknowledgement. In the golden lamplight, surrounded by silence, something unspoken was confessed. A shared loneliness had begun to ease, replaced by a tentative, burgeoning hope. The sound of a horse broke the midday stillness. It was not the steady, familiar gait of Elias's Mare. This was the arrogant clip-clop of a town horse, its rider unused to the uneven mountain terrain. Elias, who had been splitting logs near the woodpile, straightened slowly, his hand resting on the handle of the axe. He turned toward the trail, his body becoming a rigid, unmoving sentinel. Clara, who had been hanging laundry on a line stretched between two pines, felt a cold knot of dread form in her stomach. She knew who it was before he even came into view. Mr. Finch emerged from the trees, astride a sleek bay gelding. He wore town clothes that looked absurdly out of place in the rugged clearing, and his face was set in a smug, proprietary smile. He swung down from the saddle, his eyes immediately finding Clara, dismissing Elias as if he were nothing more than a part of the landscape. "Clara, my dear," he said, his voice oozing a false solicitousness. "I was worried sick. To run off like this, to the shack of a man like him." His gaze flickered to Elias, laden with contempt. Elias didn't move. He just stood there, his presence a silent, immovable fact. His knuckles were white where he gripped the axe handle. "I am not your dear, Mr. Finch," Clara said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "And this is my home now." Finch laughed, a short, unpleasant sound. "Don't be foolish. You have obligations. Your late husband's debts are now your own, and I am prepared to be most generous in helping you settle them." He took a step toward her, his intention clear. He was going to put his hands on her, to physically claim her. Before he could take a second step, Elias moved. He didn't rush. He simply placed himself between them, a solid wall of muscle and quiet fury. He still hadn't spoken a word, but his meaning was unmistakable. Finch halted, his smile faltering as he was forced to look up at the mountain man. "Step aside, you," Finch sneered. "This is a private matter." Elias's voice, when it came, was dangerously low, a growl that seemed to vibrate from the very ground. "She is under my protection." "Protection?" Finch scoffed. "You have no claim on her." "I have this one," Elias said, his eyes like chips of flint. He looked past Finch, his gaze locking with Clara's for a barest second, a silent question and a firm promise all in one. Then he looked back at the smaller man. "No man will touch you while you're under my roof." The words were not a threat. They were a law, a declaration of fact that hung in the hot, still air, as solid and unyielding as the mountain itself. Finch paled, finally understanding that he was not dealing with a hired hand. He was dealing with a boundary he would not be allowed to cross. Mr. Finch, stripped of his bluster by Elias's granite-like certainty, backed away. He mounted his horse with clumsy haste, his face a mask of thwarted entitlement. "This isn't over," he spat, more for his own benefit than theirs. "There are laws in this territory, contracts. The marshal will hear of this." He yanked on the reins, turning the horse clumsily, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and simmering malice in his wake. The clearing fell silent again, but the peace had been shattered. Clara stood frozen, her hands clenched in the fabric of her apron. A tremor ran through her, a delayed reaction to the venom in Finch's words and the raw, protective power she had just witnessed in Elias. She looked at Elias. He was still standing in the same spot, a human shield, his back to her. The axe was now resting on the ground, but his entire body was coiled with tension, his shoulders rigid. He did not turn around. He did not rush to her side or offer empty platitudes. He simply stood watch until the sound of Finch's horse had completely faded into the woods. Only then did he seem to relax, the stiffness seeping out of him in a long, slow exhale. He turned, his face grim, his eyes searching hers for any sign of distress. She felt the tears she'd been holding back prick at her eyelids. She was not a woman who cried easily, but the confrontation had scraped a raw nerve, reminding her of her vulnerability, of the precariousness of her safety. Elias saw the sheen in her eyes. He took a step toward her, then stopped, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He seemed to be fighting an instinct to reach for her, holding himself back, respecting the invisible boundary of her space even now. Instead of offering a touch she might not want, he gave her something else. He turned and walked into the cabin. A few moments later, he returned with a tin cup of water. He held it out to her. His hand was perfectly steady. She took it, their fingers brushing. The cup was cool against her trembling hands. She drank, the water a balm to her dry throat. When she was done, she looked at him over the rim of the cup. He still hadn't said anything. He didn't need to. His actions spoke a language she was beginning to understand more deeply than words. He hadn't slain a dragon for her. He had simply stood his ground. He hadn't swept her into his arms. He had brought her water. He had met her fear not with grand gestures, but with quiet, steady care. In that moment, she understood the profound difference between Finch's desire to possess and Elias' instinct to protect. One was about ownership. The other was about dignity. Night fell, but the tension from the afternoon's confrontation lingered in the small cabin. It was a tangible presence, sitting with them in the pools of shadow beyond the lamplight. Elias moved with a restless energy Clara hadn't seen before. He checked the latch on the door twice. He stood by the window for a long time, staring out into the impenetrable darkness. His routine, usually a source of quiet rhythm, was now a direct response to a threat against her, against them. The words surfaced in her mind, unbidden and startling. Them. Clara sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea he had brewed for her. The simple, earthy scent was calming. He had made it without a word, another small act of devotion that settled deep in her heart. Finally, his restless pacing stopped. He came to the table and sat in the shadows across from her, not on his usual stool, but in the empty space on the bench. He didn't speak, but his presence was a heavy, comforting weight. The lamplight carved his face into stark planes of light and shadow, highlighting the grim set of his jaw. "He will not trouble you again," he said, his voice low and certain. "How can you know that?" She whispered. "Men like him are. Persistent. I am more persistent," he stated, a simple, unassailable fact. He looked at her then, his gaze intense, stripping away all pretense. In the soft, forgiving light of the lamp, the truth of the day seemed to rise to the surface. "I do not want him to have you," he said. The words were plain, unadorned, but they carried the weight of a far more eloquent confession. It was not a claim of ownership. It was a raw admission of his own fear, his own yearning. He was not just protecting her from Finch. He was protecting the quiet world they had begun to build within these four walls. He looked down at his hands, resting on the rough-hewn table. "This place," he began, his voice dropping even lower, rough with an emotion he could not hide. "It was just a shelter before, wood and stone." He looked back up, his eyes meeting hers. "It is. Safer with you in it. It is better." The vulnerability in his admission stole her breath. He, the protector, was admitting his own need. He had been as lonely as she was. He drew a deep breath, the prelude to a choice. "You can stay," he said, the words careful, deliberate. "As long as you want. Forever, if you want. If you choose." It was not a command or an assumption. It was an invitation, an offering of a future, placed gently in her hands for her to accept or refuse. He was giving her back the one thing Finch had tried to steal, her agency. The choice was hers. And in the warm, silent heart of the cabin, she already knew her answer. 2 days later, they returned. Mr. Finch was not alone this time. Beside him, on a sturdy roan, sat the town marshal, a man with a weary face and a silver star pinned to his vest. Clara's heart plummeted. She had known Finch would not give up so easily. Elias had been mending a fence post when they rode into the clearing. He straightened up, hammer in hand, his posture instantly shifting from that of a homesteader to a guardian. He did not move to intercept them, but waited, letting them come to him. Clara came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her spine straight. She would not hide. Marshal Thompson dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry ground. "Ma'am, Elias," he said, his tone professional but not unkind. "Mr. Finch here has lodged a complaint. He has a contract signed by your late husband, making him partner in this land and all its assets upon Jacob's death." "She is not an asset," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "The contract is vaguely worded," the marshal admitted, looking uncomfortable. "Finch claims it implies a matrimonial inheritance, that he has a right to take Mrs. Morrow as his wife to settle the debt." "It's a lie," Clara said, her voice ringing with conviction as she stepped down from the porch. "Jacob would never." Finch smirked from his horse. "The law is the law, my dear. You have a choice. Come with me willingly, or the marshal will have to escort you." He was trying to physically claim her, to use the flimsy shield of a dubious law to enact his will. The marshal looked from Finch's smug face to Elias's thunderous one. "Elias, I don't want any trouble." Elias didn't even look at the marshal. His eyes were fixed on Clara. In them she saw a promise of violence, a willingness to burn the whole world down to keep her safe. But she also saw him holding it back, waiting. He was making no move to speak for her, or decide for her. The choice, as he had promised, was still hers. This was the moment, the public choice. Finch had brought the world to their door, and she had to declare her place in it. She walked forward, her steps firm and sure, until she was standing not behind Elias, but beside him. She reached out and placed her hand on his forearm. She felt the rigid muscle beneath his sleeve, a coiled spring of protective energy. He did not flinch. It was as if he had been waiting for her touch his entire life. Looking Finch directly in the eye, her voice clear and strong, she said, "This is my home. I am staying with him." The simple declaration, fortified by the quiet strength of her hand on Elias's arm, was more powerful than any legal document. It was a statement of heart, a public claiming. The marshal saw it. He saw the truth in the way they stood together, a united front against the world. He saw the devotion in the mountain men's eyes and the fierce loyalty in the widow's. He sighed, a weary sound. "Finch," he said, turning to the other man, "there's no contract in the world that can force a woman against her will. Not on my watch. You've got your answer. Leave them be." The silence Finch and the marshal left behind was more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of a battle won, of a storm that had broken and passed. The air felt clean, scoured of threats. Elias stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the spot where the riders had disappeared. The hammer he had been holding now lay forgotten in the dust at his feet. The tension hadn't left him. It radiated from him in waves, the aftermath of a fight he had been willing to have, but was relieved to have avoided. Clara's hand was still on his arm. She hadn't removed it. The warmth of her palm, the slight pressure of her fingers, seemed to be the only thing anchoring him to the quiet clearing. He was like a finely tuned instrument wound too tight, and she could feel the tremor of adrenaline running through him. He finally drew a deep, ragged breath. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. His expression was raw, unguarded, a mixture of fierce relief and a tenderness that made her heart ache. Slowly, gently, she tugged on his arm. "Come inside, Elias." He followed her without resistance, his usual self-possession replaced by a weary compliance. She led him to the chair at the table, her chair, and pushed on his shoulder until he sat. His large frame seemed to fold into the small piece of furniture, and he dropped his head into his hands with a groan. She saw it then, a raw scrape across his knuckles, where he must have struck them against the fence post when he first seen Finch. He hadn't even registered the injury. She went to the small chest, where she kept her mending and a few precious medical supplies. She brought back a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. Kneeling before him, just as she had in the heat wave, she gently took his hand. He lifted his head, watching her with those intense, dark eyes as she carefully, tenderly, began to clean the wound. It was a small injury, insignificant, but the act was not. It was aftercare. It was her turn to be the protector, to soothe the warrior after the fight. She worked in silence, her touch light and sure. He didn't pull away. He let her tend to him, his hand resting limply in hers, a complete surrender. When she finished, she didn't immediately let go. She held his hand, her smaller one covering his, her thumb stroking the rough, calloused skin. The last of the tension finally seeped out of him, his shoulders slumping. The rigid guardian was gone, and in his place was just a man. Her man. The silence was no longer empty or tense. It was full. It was a shared peace, earned and defended. They sat that way for a long time, in the quiet of their defended home, her hand still covering his on the table. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, bathing the small room in a warm, golden light. The world outside, with its predatory men and its flimsy laws, felt 1,000,000 miles away. All that was real was here, within these four walls. The scent of pine, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, the solid weight of his hand beneath hers. Elias finally stirred. He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers with hers. The fit was perfect, his large, calloused hand engulfing hers in a grip that was both strong and exquisitely gentle. He lifted their joined hands, his gaze holding hers, his eyes dark with an emotion so deep it felt ancient. "Clara," he said, his voice rough, thick with all the words he did not have. He didn't need them. She saw everything she needed to see in his face, the fierce devotion, the profound relief, the quiet, bone-deep certainty. He had offered her a choice, and she had chosen him. He had offered her a roof, and she had made it a home. He cleared his throat, as if the next words were the most important he would ever speak. "My roof," he began, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a vow spoken only for her. "Is your roof?" He paused, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "Always?" It was not a grand promise of love or a poetic declaration. It was something better. It was a statement of fact, as solid and enduring as the stone of the hearth behind them. It was a foundation, a future sealed not with a kiss, but with the quiet, unshakable promise of a shared life. A vow spoken in plain speech, meaning more than any vow she had ever heard. She squeezed his hand, her answer in the simple, trusting pressure. The lonely mountain man and the resilient widow were gone. In their place sat two people, side by side, their hands clasped in the warm light of the home they had chosen and built together.